A little after 8 a.m. on the morning of August 6, 1945, many people in the Japanese city of Hiroshima looked up into the sky to see a B 29 taking a turn. And at 8:16 a.m. in that city, the world ended. Rich Lowry of National Review here, where we defend truth, justice, and the American way every day. And I'm here to tell you that no matter what the revisionists say, it was absolutely the right call to drop the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki 80 years ago and bring the war in the Pacific to an end. It had begun years before with the horrific Japanese assault on China. We were brought in, of course, with the terrible surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, and this conflict throughout its duration was enormously costly in terms of human lives of both combatants and civilians alike. The first thing to say about the bomb is that it certainly saved American lives. Harry Truman, Secretary of War Henry Stimson, talked after the war of casualty estimates as high as 1 million if the U.S. had to invade Japan. Now, those estimates are controversial. No way of knowing whether they were correct or not, but certainly we had every reason to expect a fierce, bloody Japanese defense of its homeland. At Iwo Jima, beginning in February 1945, the Marines suffered an ungodly casualty ratio. Of the 70,000 Marines committed to the battle, almost 7,000 were killed and another 20,000 wounded. Almost all of the roughly 20,000 Japanese soldiers on the island who had been urged by their commander to kill 10 Americans before dying themselves indeed fought to the death. Okinawa was the same bloody story. The U.S. loss rate, according to the National World War II Museum, was 35%. The violence of the fight is hard to exaggerate. The 10th Army fired more than 1,105 millimeter howitzer rounds during the battle, according to the museum. Troops of the 24th Corps fired about 500,000 mortar rounds. They shot 9 million rifle bullets and 16 million .30 caliber machine gun rounds and tossed nearly 400,000 hand grenades. Then there were the relentless kamikaze attacks. The Navy lost nearly 5,000 sailors and 36 ships went down. The Japanese wanted to defeat a U.S. invasion or make it so painful that they'd gain negotiating leverage. They had massively reinforced Kyushu, where the invasion was slated to happen. They had 6,000 to 10,000 aircraft ready to resist. So whatever the number was, whether it was 5,000, 50,000, or 500,000 casualties, Truman averted them. He saved American lives. And as the President of the United States, that was his first responsibility. The awful truth is that the atom bombs weren't that different from the incendiary campaign that had already been undertaken from the air by Curtis LeMay. Now, those attacks, they didn't come out of anywhere. His predecessor, Haywood Hansel, tried precision attacks that were costly to the United States and didn't work. Just the technology wasn't there. So LeMay takes over, decides on low-altitude incendiary attacks as a different and better approach, and they are hellishly effective. The raid on Tokyo, notoriously March 1945, kills 100,000 people, and LeMay keeps going from there. The justification for the incendiary campaign that dispersed home industries made a significant contribution to Japan's industrial effort wasn't wrong, although the bombing ranged much more widely. LeMay's bombers burned down more than 178 square miles of 66 Japanese cities. There's really no moral case against the atom bombs. That also doesn't apply to the firebombing. So if both of those tactics are off the table, well, what was left? Well, there was a blockade. It was less spectacular than the B-29s, but U.S. submarines had kneecapped the Japanese economy by destroying its shipping, and the noose was tightening. Already in 1945, Japan was staring down the barrel of mass starvation, with the daily intake of calories steadily dwindling. A Japanese historian wrote after the war that some estimates were, in the immediate end of the conflict, that some 10 million Japanese were in danger of dying of starvation. The new U.S. bombing campaign near the end of the war was going to go after the Japanese rail system, which would have made the situation immediately more dire. The mining of Japan's home waters to hamper shipping further was called, not subtly, Operation Starvation. The problem, obviously, with starving a country out is that lots of innocent people are going to die. There are no fireballs, but there's incredible privation and death by the hundreds of thousands or millions all the same. What about letting the Soviets do the dirty work? Well, this would have had significant geopolitical downsides and wasn't a particularly moral option either. If you want to protect a society from the ravages of war, the last thing you wish upon it is a Russian invasion. And indeed, the very brief Soviet invasion near the end resulted in hundreds of thousands of deaths. So if we hadn't dropped the bombs, if we hadn't engaged in the incendiary campaign, if we hadn't blockaded Japan and the Soviets hadn't invaded, well, what's left? A U.S. ground invasion. And by the way, massive ground invasions aren't antiseptic operations. They unfortunately kill lots of civilians as well. Again, look at the horrifying record of Okinawa, where an estimated 100,000 or 150,000 civilians died. How many more times that would have died if we had gone into the home islands to bring Tokyo to heel? And by the way, in the real world, it's impossible to separate out ground invasions from other acts of violence. One of the purposes of the incendiary campaign was to pave the way for a ground invasion. Now, some folks try to engage in a just so story and say, oh, well, the Japanese leadership would have quit on our terms anyway, even if we hadn't dropped the bombs, or they're just about on the verge of quitting for other reasons. This is complete nonsense. There is zero evidence of this, none, from the men who constituted the decision makers in Japan. In explaining ultimately the decision finally to quit the war, Emperor Hirohito put a heavy emphasis not on the Soviet invasion, which was no doubt a contributing factor, but on the atomic bomb and the aerial attacks. In his message ending the war, he spoke of, quote, a new and most cruel bomb, the power of which to do damage is indeed incalculable, taking the toll of many innocent lives, close quote. In December 1945, Japan's prime minister at the end of the war explained that the Supreme War Council proceeded with its plan to resist an American invasion, quote, until the atomic bomb was dropped, after which they believed the United States need not land when it had such a weapon. So at that point, they decided that it would be best to sue for peace. If you want chapter and verse on this, by the way, you should go to the classic definitive work on this question, Downfall by Richard Frank. Came out years ago, groundbreaking at the time, still extremely authoritative. Now, the attack on Nagasaki, by the way, is often portrayed as unnecessary, but we did it to show that we had more than one bomb and that we weren't going to be dissuaded by the international reaction to Hiroshima from using it. The tragic fact is that we were not going to get the Japanese to stand down without a cataclysm, one way or the other, whether it was from the air or on the ground, whether it was using technology that was very old or very new, or whether it was sudden or drawn out. Imperial Japan was aggressive and remorseless. Its attacks on Pearl Harbor and treatment of U.S. prisoners were enormities enough, but it killed perhaps as many as 20 million people in China alone. Everywhere it went, from Nanking to Manila, it brought large-scale bestial cruelty. And as it was wrestled onto the defensive, it resolved to fight with the irrationality of a suicide cult. The defense of the homeland was supposed to involve waves of people wielding wooden spears. The film Oppenheimer uses to great effect the famous haunting line that the scientist is associated with from the Bhagavad Gita. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. In the Pacific in the 1930s and 1940s, it was Imperial Japan that was the destroyer of worlds. It had to be stopped. The bombs stopped it at great human cost, yes, but the end of the war brought peace and amity where there had only been violence and despair.